So welcome all for the first of the two-part series of the Understanding Dharma series. And today is the first day. And so Dharma is a very intrinsic and fundamental concept of Vedic knowledge. Not only the Vedic knowledge, but the word Dharma is also extensively used in Buddhism and also in Jainism. And in fact, this word is very, very central and important to understand, to appreciate what the Vedic knowledge is, or in the modern terms, the religion of Hinduism in some sense, but it is much more broader than just a simple religion. And especially in an age where people consider religion to be dogma based out of some common beliefs, and therefore people tend to consider that the framework in which the religion is based is actually very weak, and therefore it should be completely taken away. And unfortunately, this is a misunderstanding and perhaps not studying sufficiently enough what constitutes the Vedic knowledge or the Vedic texts. So today we'll try to understand what Dharma means and how it is relevant and why it is relevant in one's own life. And I'm not sure if we will be able to cover how to follow Dharma. Perhaps we may have to take it to the next session. So we'll try to cover some aspects of this. So one important thing that I would like to mention in the very beginning is that the concept of Dharma that we are talking about today is based out of the two important books, and in fact I'll also mention a third one. The concept of Dharma that we are talking is from the pages of Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita, and there is also a third book called Chaitanya Charitamrita. Now one may question, why is that you're mentioning specific books, texts? Why isn't Dharma specific to some individual in their own way? Why wouldn't different dharmas be accommodated? Why there is need to refer to some text? So that will be our first section, where we'll try to explore where should we go to understand what is Dharma. And in the second part, we will look how should we learn Dharma or understand Dharma, and why is it important to understand Dharma. And finally, and hopefully, we will cover upon the topic of what is Dharma, at least briefly today. So first, Bhagavad Gita. So quite often these days, people tend to ascertain that this is my truth, or this is my belief, or it is some sort of a common belief that we are going to take as what it constitutes to be truth, or what constitutes to be Dharma. But according to the Vedic knowledge, the Dharma comes from the, if one traces back to understand where is this word Dharma originating from, where is it first mentioned, what are its meanings. So then one has to go back to the Vedic literatures, where there's an extensive mention of what constitutes Dharma, what is the meaning of Dharma, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the Vedic literatures are too vast and too difficult to understand in totality. And therefore, the book Bhagavad Gita is much more significant for us today than ever before. The reason being, the Bhagavad Gita teaches the essence of Vedic knowledge. That means one can get the essence of what is Dharma, how to apply in one's own life, very easily by studying Bhagavad Gita. This is a very important principle, that until unless we do not know the essence, just knowing the periphery of things is not sufficient for one to really appreciate the subject matter. And the second is that the Bhagavad Gita is spoken by the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna himself. That means it is completely authoritative. So authority is another very important principle in understanding these fundamental concepts like Dharma. So quite often in this age of internet, there is a lot of misinformation, misinterpretation, and people misrepresent the essence of the knowledge. And therefore, it is very important that one chooses the right authority and the right source to get the right knowledge. And thirdly, it is very important to note that the aim of Bhagavad Gita is to revive our Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal occupation. That means Bhagavad Gita is that text which is speaking about Dharma throughout the pages. And also, it is completely authoritative. And therefore, when one learns a subject from an authoritative source and from a source which is talking or specialized in the subject that we are looking at, then that is a relevant source. And just to clarify this further, if one looks at the very first verse of Bhagavad Gita, this is actually from the second chapter, but even before this, the very first verse, Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre, the very beginning of Bhagavad Gita starts with this word Dharma. And even if one looks at the very beginning of second chapter, Arjuna, the great warrior, he is asking a question to Lord Krishna. What is this question? This question is, Karpanya doshopada swabhava prichhami tvam dharma sammudha chetaha. So his question is that I'm perplexed. I'm not sure what to do, what not to do. Now, this is something that we all face in our lives. We are perplexed at various situations, whether I should choose this or that, this job or that job. Should I do PhD or should I do something else? Should I marry someone? Should I not marry someone? So there are various questions that we are always encountering, and quite often we do not have a solution. And in the modern day, people act whimsically quite often, and they face the consequences too. But here is a science that is being talked about. How do one make actual choices about what is right, what is not, what is one's duty, and what is not one's duty? And this very fundamental question posed by Arjuna forms the basis for the entire discussion of next 16 chapters as what is dharma, what is duty. And Arjuna is not only asking, what is my general duty, but is saying, please tell me clearly what is best for me. So there is one kind of duty that I do something. Everyone is living their life, so I also lead my life in some way. But Arjuna is not interested in some sort of a suggestion or some sort of an opinion. He's talking about, please tell me which is the ultimate good, which is my ultimate duty. And the second point that I will come back later on is to refer how did he approach to get answers to these questions. So this is very important. Until unless we do not know what is dharma, we cannot act properly. This is very important. And second point is that the Bhagavad Gita is based upon this question of what is the dharma of Arjuna. And in another sense, it is applicable to all of us. And that's the subject matter of Bhagavad Gita, and therefore Bhagavad Gita forms a very authoritative text to understand what constitutes dharma. The second part is that I'm going to talk about the second book, that is Srimad Bhagavatam. Here is a picture where the Emperor Maharaj Parikshit, he is sitting below, and on the chair or Vyasasana is sitting Sukadeva Goswami, a great teacher. He's one of the greatest sages. And Parikshit Maharaj, the emperor, had about 7 days to live. So he came to know that he has only 7 days to live. And then he asked some very wonderful questions. And that forms the basis of entire Srimad Bhagavatam. And let us look at one such statement. So this is from 19th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, and 24th verse. It says, Tatascha vaha prichyam imam viprache vishrabhya vipra iti kritya tayam Sarvatmana mriyam manais cha krityam shuddham cha tatra amrishatma bhi yuktaha. So this is a very important question. And here Maharaj Parikshit is asking two fundamental questions. He's saying, "O trustworthy Brahmanas, or great sages, I now ask you about my immediate duty." And then he says, "Please, after proper deliberation, tell me of the unalloyed duty of everyone in all circumstances." So this is a very wonderful question. What is that one is supposed to do all the time, in all circumstances? Is there something that one can do all the time, in all circumstances? And he's saying, more specifically, of those who are just about to die. This is even more wonderful question. So one is to ask, what should I do in general? But then even more deeper question is that what is that one supposed to do when one is about to die? So imagine someone says, you have only one day left. And most of us perhaps would leave out our jobs and our duties that we are doing today and say, I want to do something else the rest of the day that I'll not be doing what I'm doing. That means it is very important for us to recognize that we quite often try to forget the fact that there is something known as death, that it's going to come. Quite often we try to suppress the thought of death because we fear it, or because we do not know what to do. But an intelligent man recognizes that what is eventual, what is absolutely certain that I face, I must find a way to address that concern or issue if there exists one. And this question, these two questions asked by Maharaj Parikshit, again forms the basis of Srimad Bhagavatam, for which there are 12 cantos, or in fact 11 cantos remaining of the 11 cantos address these two questions in detail. So this is another very fundamental text which is talking about what is one's primary duty, what is one's dharma, and therefore this text also forms a very important basis for one to understand what constitutes dharma and subsequent topics related to it. Further, in the very beginning of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a verse which says, Dharma projita kaitavo atro parmo nirmatsaranam satam. The Srimad Bhagavatam is a special text for the reason, very in the beginning it says that it excludes all that kind of religion or all kind of those dharmas which are kaitava or cheating. Cheating means which do not give the ultimate benefit. And Srimad Bhagavatam talks about that ultimate duty, that ultimate benefit one can acquire by performing that duty is the subject matter of Srimad Bhagavatam. And therefore, referring to this text is equally important when one is speaking about dharma. And furthermore, there are various examples and case studies presented throughout Srimad Bhagavatam to describe what constitutes dharma and what constitutes adharma, what constitutes right and wrong, how do we ascertain what is what. So here is an example on the left side of an old man named as Ajamila. He was about to die and his soul being pulled by Yamadutas, or the servants of Yamaraj. On the other hand, for one reason that he chanted the name of Lord Narayana at the point of his death, the Vishnu Dutas or Vishnu carriers, the servants of Lord Vishnu, appear saying that you could not, they come down to say that the Yamadutas cannot snatch away the soul of Ajamila. And there is a wonderful discussion of what constitutes dharma and what constitutes adharma. Similarly, on the right side is another wonderful pastime, or where Kansa is trying to kill his sister Devaki. Devaki and Vasudeva are the parents of Lord Krishna, and as soon as Kansa comes to hear that he is going to be killed by the son of his sister, he is immediately prepares to kill his sister. But then Vasudeva, he wonderfully navigates the situation by explaining what is, by wonderfully enacting what is one's duty. And that's also wonderfully described in Srimad Bhagavatam. So basically, it's very important that whenever we are discussing these fundamental topics, it's important we refer to the right text, right sources, and the right examples to appreciate what this subject matter is. And finally, I'm going to mention one more text, that is Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. That is another very important text which summarizes the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy and even more the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And this is another wonderful text which not only teaches what is the philosophy of Lord Chaitanya, but it also brings in, especially from the commentary of Srila Prabhupada, it also brings in context what the Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy is in relation to other traditions. And therefore, it also gives a perspective of how there is a synthesis between different thoughts of understanding what is Dharma. So, my first takeaway point for everyone is that the concept of Dharma has to be understood from the authorized sources and authorized teachers, without which one is quite often to be baffled, and secondly, one is not going to get the benefit of understanding what constitutes Dharma. So with that first point, let me go to section 2. So in this section, we'll try to understand what is the need to understand Dharma. So one may say, it makes sense that I should go to the right place to understand what this is. But is there a need to understand Dharma? So in order to understand this, let us take first an example of a pharmacy. Imagine today we see a pandemic, and imagine a person goes around and he says, don't worry about pandemic, I know a pharmacy, I can go and take any medicine. I know there are many medicines. Would that work? He might claim that these are all medicines, so why not I take something? But an intelligent man will recognize that not all medicines are meant to cure all diseases. They have a specific reason, and therefore one has to approach the right person to get the right medicine. So similarly, it is important to note that there are different understandings of Dharma. Either one understands Dharma, or whether one does not understand Dharma, one is doing some activity. But just like there is a difference between taking a right medicine which cures one's illness and a medicine which may not cure one's disease, and sometimes there might be medicines which might even aggravate one's disease. And therefore, it is important to note that one has to find the right effective Dharma of one's life so as to make solution to the fundamental problems of life. And we will just see a small scenario which is mentioned in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. So here are two great personalities, Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who is standing, and at his feet is Sri Sanatana Goswami. Srila Sanatana Goswami is a disciple of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he was a great scholar. He knew many languages. He was a minister in the Nawab Hussain Shah's government, and he was well appreciated by people. But he recognized that in spite of the societal name, fame, and appreciation, he still does not know some things which are very fundamental. And therefore, he approaches Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu with with blade of grass between his teeth. Now this symbolizes his humility. He is begging for knowledge. Srila Prabhupada, although I'll not elaborate a lot as how one should acquire this understanding of Dharma, Srila Prabhupada in one place says that understanding Dharma is not very difficult. The only important criteria, or the prime criteria, Prabhupada says, that one's slate should be empty. That if one is able to put aside one's preconceived notions, is able to put aside one's obstinate ideas and rational framework, and hear with an open mind to the right bona fide spiritual master, then if one has that qualification, Prabhupada says that one can easily understand the essence of spiritual knowledge. And this is spoken by Srila Prabhupada in this context of Srila Sanatana Goswami as how humble he was in his approach. And he says these two statements. He says, Ke ami kene amaya jare tapatraya, iha nahi jani ke mane hita hoya. So here, Srila Sanatana Goswami is asking two questions to Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He's saying, Ke ami, who am I? Kene amaya jare tapatraya. Why do the threefold miseries always give me trouble? If I do not know this, how can I be benefited? So as I was telling, if one does not know the right medicine, one cannot cure one's own illness. Similarly, if one is suffering, and if one does not know the cure, what is the benefit? Isn't it? So Srila Sanatana Goswami is saying that I have great societal position, I have name, fame, wealth, but I do not know who am I, and neither I know why there are threefold miseries and why are they giving me trouble. Now this is a very, very intelligent question. As we were hearing in the other class a few days ago, that usually people, when they see something, they ignore, they just go on doing their life. Some people question, what is this? So for example, the apple is falling, and someone may question, why is this falling? What is the cause of it? So one can try to analyze what is the reason behind it. And even furthermore, people can go even deeper to understand what is the intent of all these things. Why do these laws exist at all? Why should apple fall down? What is the reason behind it? Who is doing this? Why it exists in the way it exists? And so it is very important to get to the core of the questions. Until unless one does not go to the core of the fundamentals of existence, one will not be able to understand how to solve the problems associated with life. And until unless one is not solving one's life's problem, he is not actually benefiting to the fullest of what he can. And therefore, this question of Srila Sanatana Goswami is very pertinent and important. And further, he says, Sadhya sadhana tattva pushite na jani, kripa kari sabha tattva kaha ta apani. So further, he says, not only I do not know who am I and why am I suffering, I also do not know how to inquire about the goal of life and the process for obtaining it. Being merciful upon me, please explain all these truths. So, as I said, as Srila Prabhupada mentioned, to be a complete slate. Please explain me. I actually do not know how to ask, neither I know what is the process to it. Can you please help me understand these truths? And now this attitude and the realizing the necessity is a very prerequisite for one to appreciate the concept of Dharma even further. And to elaborate this further, the existence in which we live right now is said to be material existence, that the spirit soul, the living entity, is considered spiritual in nature, and we are surrounded by an atmosphere which is reciprocal, or in the sense inverse. So the nature of the spirit is said to be Sat, Chit and Ananda, whereas the nature of the material existence is said to be Asat, Achit and Nirananda. What it means is that there is an incompatibility. Sat means eternity, Chit means full of knowledge, Ananda means blissfulness. If one pays careful attention, each one of us are seeking these things in different ways. One is trying to look for bliss, and therefore one is doing various activities and hoping that I will find happiness here, I will find bliss here. And one is fearful of being ignorant, and therefore one is going to various universities, doing various courses, hoping that he will acquire knowledge which will make him better. And eventually no one wants to die, everyone wants to remain eternal. And therefore one is trying different methods and ways and means to make sure that one can live better. But unfortunately, in the world that we live, it's temporary. There is ignorance and there is no bliss, and therefore there is a sense of incompatibility between the nature of the living entity and the nature of the world around. And this incompatibility leads to something known as struggle for existence. Struggle for existence exists everywhere, whether one is in be the president of America or a small worker in a small country. Everyone is undergoing the struggle for existence. And a man of intelligence will question, why is there struggle for existence? Why are there threefold miseries? I didn't elaborate threefold miseries before, but just to elaborate the point, what are threefold miseries? Threefold miseries are miseries, one, because of one's own body and mind. Sometimes when one's mind is troubling so much, not someone else. Sometimes the body is not well, it's tired, it has a disease, and it's troubling. Or the second form of threefold misery, the misery because of other living entity. Sometimes the other person does not treat you well. Sometimes someone comes and scolds for no reason. So we do not know why am I suffering because of another living entity, a mosquito, or maybe something else. And third form of threefold misery is a misery because of the natural circumstances. Sometimes it's too cold, sometimes it's too hot, or something else. And therefore, no living entity can say that I'm exempt from these miseries of life. Artificially, one may see a billboard thinking that I'll become fully happy if I buy a house or a car or something else. But the truth of the fact is that the struggle for existence is common for everyone. And a man of intelligence questions, why is this? Why is that our very existence is in the atmosphere of non-existence? Actually, we are not meant to be threatened by non-existence. So, although this is slightly deeper, I'll not try to touch upon so much, but just to bring in a point that there is a certain existential struggle that everyone is undergoing. And a man of intelligence tries to dig deeper into the subject of where is this fundamental struggle for existence coming from? What is the nature of existence? What is the nature of everything in existence? Why there is certain incompatibility? And it is very important to note that even if one is undergoing great academic studies in the modern day, still people are not aware of these fundamental concepts. And it's important to recognize that the concept of Dharma very clearly and scientifically explains these fundamental concepts of existence and things around it. So with that as the second section, where we are just getting a sense of why Dharma is so important, that by understanding Dharma, one can overcome the struggle for existence. One can appreciate the real nature of one's own true self and lead a life which is full of satisfaction, freedom from anxiety, freedom from threefold miseries. So there is a great value in understanding what constitutes Dharma. And it is also important to recognize that if one is open-minded, inquisitive, and pays attention to hear from the right source and right teacher, one can grasp the subject matter very easily. With that as the second section, let us get into understanding what is Dharma. So, before we truly understand what is Dharma from the teachings of Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, let me just take you through some of the answers that were given by the participants who registered for this program as what is Dharma. So someone said Dharma means karma, Dharma means Hindu, Dharma means a way of living, Dharma means to do your duties without attachment, someone saying doing the right thing, and someone else told me that acting according to my understanding of life. So these are just a portion of the text taken from the answers given by the participants. So this is just to give an overview of what people think about what is Dharma. And it is also important to recognize at this point that the word Dharma, which has a Sanskrit root, and it has different connotations. There is no single English equivalent for this word. And therefore, sometimes people get confused and fail to recognize the total meaning behind what this word is. And just to add further, so a common understanding of people, which is commonly attributed in YouTube and other websites, is religion. Dharma means religion, or Dharma means just some sort of a duty. So although these common understandings can have varied degree of what they actually mean, Srila Prabhupada explains these words in a context for us to appreciate further as what is this religion, or how is Dharma religion, or how Dharma is duty, or what sort of duty is Dharma, and things like that. So we'll try to maybe reach some of these concepts at the end of the class. And now let's begin try to understand some aspects of what this word Dharma is from the teachings of Bhagavad Gita. So firstly, it's important to recognize that unlike some of the modern day rationalist intellectual thinkers who consider religion is not based on dogmas, or it is based out of whimsical thought, is completely wrong. If someone really wants to speak about religion, they should actually talk about Dharma, especially in the context of Vedic religion or the Sanatana Dharma. And this fundamental concept is so important even for a practitioner to actually make further progress in the spiritual life. So let's try to, okay. So the word Dharma has a root called Dhr, which means to hold, to bear, to support, or to sustain. So basically everything is sustained by something, and the word root of Dharma means to sustain something. So let's analyze further what this means. So Dharma refers to that which is constantly existing with the particular object. Now this is a very important principle which Srila Prabhupada explains so well in Bhagavad Gita, very in the beginning of introduction. So what this means is that if one pays attention to any object in the world, it has got an intrinsic quality or characteristic associated with it, that which cannot be separated. And as we will see further examples, as what is that is existing with a particular object always. And that is something very important to note. And it is also important to note that what we are talking is an intrinsic characteristic of the object. So just like I can use this for multiple reasons. I mean, I can use as a plaything, or I can use to put on top of a glass, or I can do many things. These are all external characteristics of the object as of how I use. But there are certain intrinsic characteristics of the object. Oh, I'm sorry, the people in the internet may not be able to see what I was trying to show. So I was trying to show this object here. Now I can play with this. I can put on the top of a glass, or I can do multiple things. So this all constitute the external use of this object, but whereas it has a certain characteristics which are very much intrinsic. So just to elaborate this concept of what constitutes intrinsic characteristic, Srila Prabhupada gives two wonderful examples. So one of them is that the example of fire. If one looks carefully at the characteristics of fire, one can very soon understand that heat and light are two intrinsic characteristics of fire. So wherever there is fire, there is heat and light. It does not matter whether I believe it, whether I don't believe it, whether I know it, whether I don't know it. I touch fire, I will experience the warmth of fire, the heat of fire. That means this quality, which is intrinsic always, which is not extrinsic, which is not my conception, which is not someone's knowing. It is something which is existing always with the fire. That is the dharma of the fire. Similarly, if one considers water, liquidity is intrinsic to water. And it is wherever there is water, the characteristic of liquidity is always with the water. So this nature, the intrinsic characteristic, is called the dharma of the object. And similarly, in the modern science we speak, electron has an intrinsic spin. So spin is said to be intrinsic. It is not something externally induced, or it's not my conception or my assumption. No. So similarly, if one pays careful attention and one looks around, one sees that every object in creation has an intrinsic quality. Now, in the modern education system, almost all the schools are teaching to a very certain degree to understand what are the characteristics of the physical objects. What is matter? Or maybe a little more further is to work around mathematics or some higher frameworks of some string theory or some sort of a thing to get a sense of what the physical world is. But that also is understood very partially. However, even more deeper and bigger question that is more important and pertinent to study, but which is sadly not studied in the modern day educational system, is what is the intrinsic quality of the living entity? So if someone asks, what is the quality of the living entity? What is my nature? I understand the nature of metal. I study about it. I study the nature of maybe polymers or different classes of materials. Or maybe I study the nature of programming, of how does it work, a computer, and I take benefit out of it. But if someone asks, what is your nature? What is the best that you can do with your life? What is the goal of life? What is life? People struggle to answer these questions. And unfortunately, neither these subject matters are taught in the modern day educational system. And therefore, there is a large amount of chaos in the life of students. Even after they graduate, they're not sure what to do with life because the big questions, the fundamental questions, still remain perplexing. And not only with students, but with anyone who is not having knowledge of the subject, the life always seems perplexing at different points of time in different ways. So this principle of dharma is so significant to appreciate that thing. So as how one can overcome some of the perplexities of life, in fact all of the perplexities of life. So this word dharma is usually discussed in addition with another term called sanatana dharma. So one may say that, okay, this is the intrinsic quality of this thing for some time, but wouldn't that change? But then there is another term which is being used here, is called sanatana dharma. So this qualifier of the word sanatana means that which has neither beginning nor end. So the subject matter of these texts, Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, they are talking about that intrinsic characteristic which has neither beginning nor end, that quality which is eternal, and that is also in connection with the living entity and also the nature of the existence and the source of existence and what is the nature of all these things. And it also further refers, the word Sanatana Dharma refers to that activity which cannot be changed, which is intrinsic to that object. So this perspective that there is dharma, there is intrinsic nature to everything, and then there is also Sanatana Dharma or nature, intrinsic nature, which is eternal, which has no beginning nor end. So how do we understand this? So that requires for us to understand the nature of the things which are eternal. So one important concept is that to understand our own nature. So if we look carefully around, the material nature around which we live our lives, everything seems temporary. This table, maybe 100 years down the line, would not exist the way it is, or many things around that we see today will not exist 1,000 years down the lane. Neither we would have found them 1,000 years ago. So the nature of the world that we are around is temporary in nature. So it does not truly exist in the time of eternity. But if you look carefully, that apart from matter, there is another constituent element, that is the living entity. So now, if one looks carefully, the nature of the living entity is conscious, whereas matter is not conscious. And secondly, the living entity is, according to the text, Bhagavad Gita, the beautiful verse which says, Dehino asmin yatha dehe kaumaram yavanam jara tatha dehantara praptir dhiras tatra namuhyati. So according to Bhagavad Gita, the living entity, the spiritual entity, the spiritual soul, the spirit soul, which is existing within the body, is seeing that there is a transformation in the body from boyhood to youth to old age, but the individual who is seeing all these changes has not changed his identity. That means that the soul is eternal, whereas there is change of the body. And similarly, at the point of death, the soul remains existing while it transforms to another body. So, according to the text of Srimad Bhagavad Gita and Bhagavatam, the nature of the spirit is of a different kind from what we see around of that of matter. And not recognizing the simple fact, everyone is perplexed about who am I? And what is my true nature? And what is my duty, true duty? And because of not knowing who am I, one creates various kinds of manodharma. Manodharma means the duties or understandings that erupt from one's speculation or one's own mind, which is limited, or from the societal understanding of what constitutes one's true nature. And therefore, one emphasizes too much on this societal or man-made dharmas or man-made duties, and one does not still feel satisfied because he has not done something which is intrinsically to be done, which is accordance with his true nature, which is in accordance with his true duty. And that is the spiritual duty, the spiritual nature. And therefore, until unless one does not understand this dharma of the living entity and the constitutional position of the living entity, the perplexity and the anxiety of the life continue. And just to elaborate this point of what is the constitutional nature of the living entity and what is the constitutional duty, just like we saw the discussion between Srila Sanatana Goswami and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, after the two questions asked by Srila Sanatana Goswami, explains the answers to all these questions. And he says that the constitutional position of the living entity is to render service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So this is, I will briefly touch upon this, and I will welcome any questions. This itself is a big subject matter, so please do ask any questions if you have in this regard. So the first point that is being made here is that if one carefully looks around, everyone is active, the soul is active, and therefore at every moment of time, everyone is acting, irrespective of a small insect, a plant, or a human being. Everyone is acting. Now, if one pays further more attention, this activity is in service. That means, here Srila Prabhupada is giving the example that one is serving the other is serving other, and other serving others, and so on and so forth. So common example is that a friend serving another friend is to act for the benefit of others, so that one gets some pleasure or some sort of benefit. It could be a monetary benefit if you work for a company, and it could be some sort of a loving exchange if it's the wife serves the husband and the husband serves the wife, or mother serves the son and vice versa. So if one looks carefully, if one is not serving some human being, one is serving some animal, a cat, a dog. And there is no exception. Even if one thinks that I'm the president of the country, actually he's serving the people. He's not free from service. So even the greatest president or the greatest position in this world, to a layman in the world, everyone is rendering some form of service. And this nature of service is very intrinsic to each of the living entity. And it is being said, by nature, the living entity, which is a spiritual spark, is emanating from the supreme absolute truth, the supreme person. And therefore, just like there is a natural relationship between the parents and the child, there is a natural relationship between the spirit soul and the supreme absolute truth, or the supreme person, supreme personality of Godhead, and there is a natural exchange of service and between the living entity and the Supreme Lord. So when the living entity renders service to the Supreme Lord, that fulfills the intrinsic nature, the intrinsic duty of the living entity. And when that happens, the living entity finds complete satisfaction, complete bliss. He is in full of joy. And that fulfillment of his true dharma, or in other words, this is also known as the paradharma, or the highest dharma. There are so many dharmas which are being created, but amongst them there is the highest dharma. And when one enacts this highest dharma, one finds complete fulfillment of life. Not only one finds complete fulfillment, he also finds freedom from the miseries of existence. He remains detached from the threefold miseries. And very soon he could go back to the spiritual world, spiritual existence, his true existence. And therefore, this missing link of not knowing where should one put one's service tendency, because everyone has a loving tendency. And the idea of service is to get some form of love or some form of fulfillment of that loving propensity of the individual. But quite often we all see in different circumstances, it is never completely fulfilled. But here it is being said that when one renders service to the Supreme Person, who is complete, who is full of bliss, full of reservoir of pleasure, and who is full of love, when one does service to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, then one's life is said to be full of satisfaction. The spiritual nature, the spiritual satisfaction that we are looking for, the spiritual love that we are looking for gets fulfilled. And without that, our struggle for existence will go on in spite of rendering different kinds of temporary dharmas, which do not give us fulfillment that we are seeking for. And so this is one important principle which Bhagavad Gita and Srila Prabhupada wonderfully brings this in the very beginning of Bhagavad Gita. Although I had to jump few concepts to bring to this conclusion, but it is important to recognize the spiritual nature of our spirit soul, that we are not this material bodies, but we are beyond this something. We are spiritual beings in the material body, and we have a spiritual duty, the duty of the soul, there is a nature of the spirit, and until unless that duty is performed, one is not finding the true satisfaction, the true nature of the spirit, and therefore the struggle is continuing. But if one can appreciate this fundamental dharma and execute, we'll discuss further more in detail how would one deal with the temporary dharmas that one is encountering with the real higher dharma that one has to perform. How do we look at these two things, and how would one handle these things? So those will be some of the things that we'll discuss tomorrow. So I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
How do we understand what is the dharma of the human being? Like actually by the constitutional position of the human is to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But it is very difficult to render the service for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since we have been attached with the matter for life after life. So how do we come to the platform where we have to always think about Lord and always serve Him, always do something for Him?
Okay, that's a good question. So something that we'll discuss in detail a little more tomorrow, but just to briefly answer, so the first concept is to recognize what is our dharma. So not knowing our dharma, we'll never enact that dharma. So it is equally important for us to be equipped with the right knowledge. So reading books, Srila Prabhupada's books, Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavatam, so in the association of devotees, we come to know that what is my true duty. That is, what is my dharma? That is first point. And as I mentioned, one will look into this further, that there is always a need of a spiritual master. So that's why it is very important for one to surrender to a true teacher, just like in the case of Arjuna, he is surrendering to the Supreme Lord. In case of Parikshit Maharaj, he is surrendering to the instructions of Sukadeva Goswami. And Srila Sanatana Goswami is surrendering to the instructions of Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So to be willing to follow the instructions of a pure teacher, a pure devotee of the Lord, a bona fide spiritual master, is a very important quality. If one has this quality, that one is willing to follow the instructions of a bona fide spiritual master, then in due course of time, one will be able to perform one's true dharma in its truest sense. But Srila Prabhupada's instructions of chanting and all these are actually awakening ourselves to the true dharma that we are supposed to do all the time. So Srila Prabhupada has given us a practical method and a program as how to enact, how to go towards that ultimate dharma that we are supposed to do. Hare Krishna, Kushi. Any other questions or comments?
Great. What you saw.
Although we took some leap at the end, I just want to maybe just summarize in 2 more minutes, perhaps if there are no comments or questions. It's important to recognize that there is an intrinsic nature to everything that is existing, and only when we know the true nature of things as they are, the intrinsic characteristics, and only then we can actually make true benefit. And of the different objects, the most important object is our own self, to understand who we are, who am I. That is very, very fundamental. Only when one can know one's own true self, one can act in a way which is truly beneficial for one's own self. And that is the subject matter of Dharma, to inquire into these questions of what is the true nature of the material world, what is my true nature, what is the nature of that absolute truth from which everything is emanating, and what is the relationship, and in this relationship, how do I act? And in tomorrow's session, we will see we all have different tendencies, different natures, and we also have different temporary dharmas or temporary duties. How do we work in a scenario where we are having so many things to do? Can we still do our ultimate dharma, the spiritual dharma, which leads us to the complete fulfillment?